Les, not only do we appreciate your fine singing and leading us in song, I also appreciate you adjusting the microphone back to what is the average height for me, but apparently not average for everybody else. In life, a lot of times, it's the little things that build the quality of a relationship. That's how it is with God in some ways, but God is also so magnified that His greatness sometimes overwhelms us. And some subjects also can be overwhelming when we begin to try to pick and consider and detail our way through that complexity. I want you to think for a moment about life through the lenses of God's creation that are a little bit different than our own. Because as we talk about justice, specifically understanding justice from the perspective of God, we ourselves are incredibly limited by our smallness. And the smallness of mankind is massive in comparison to the smallness of one. The scope of humanity from creation to the end of the days is, quite frankly, on the personal level, way beyond my individual ability to pull into my brain and grapple with. Even generationally, thinking a few generations behind myself and trying to forecast a few ahead, it becomes what feels to be an insurmountable task. But let's narrow our focus a little bit and perhaps consider it a different way. You see, if we were to talk about biblical justice, God's justice, justice and righteousness in the sight of God, and how the Bible informs us about justice, what if we thought about it this way? If you and I were praying mantises, you know those super awesome, super cool bugs? And they're cool to look at, right? Do you realize it would be socially acceptable to devour your mate? Totally fine. And all the other praying mantises would be like, yep, it's the right choice. Or, if you or I were a honey badger, you would have no regard for any other animal anywhere, because the honey badger, you don't care. Right? That'd be normal. Or, if you or I were pandas, man, pandas are great, right? How many of us love to go to the zoo and see the koalas and the pandas and stuff? Pandas are cool. You realize that for a panda, it's totally normal, if they have twins, to abandon one of them. Just leave it behind and only raise one. All of those are built by God's creation. They are social order rules that exist within the boundaries of the things that God has created. We remind ourselves in the Bible that all the things that are created are upheld by the word of Christ, of His power. But if humans, mankind, do any of those things, if we behave like the praying mantis, the badger, or the panda, it's wrong. It's unfair, uncomfortable, and unjust. So why is it that humans, as a part of God's creation, throughout all creation, care about justice in the ways that we do? Why, then, is that a pressing need and has always been a pressing need of humanity? The Bible actually gives a very rich and wide discussion of the subject of justice. Even in the very beginning, page 1 of your Bible, as rendered for us in Genesis chapter 1, humanity is set in a different space. We're set apart from all the other creatures, in part due to a significant shift in details. We, unlike all of creation, are made in the image of God. Now, there's a lot of ways to think through that idea of what it means to be made in the image of God. In part, it is presented to us as a duality, and that being made in the image of God requires male and female. In part, it's also part of the perspective of being a recipient of the breath of God. And to be made in the image of God means you're a receiver of that breath of God. Yet there's an actual eventual distinction that shifts our specific perspective from all of the rest of creation. And it's actually linked to something that's very troubling. If you remember for a moment, what was the one specific, unique rule that was a prohibition for man post-creation? Think for a moment. Don't do something, right? Like the first basic rule of life was don't eat that tree. Don't eat the fruit of that tree. The outcome wasn't that your tummy would be upset. Like a lot of times food rules are about don't make yourself sick because you're going to eat that. In this case, the food rule was a lot more than physiological, right? They would then have knowledge that shifted them completely. That fundamental shift that gave them the knowledge of both good and evil is the change that takes place that completely turns the garden upside down. Man's knowledge of good and evil, I will suggest to you, is one of the driving realities of our deep questions about justice and need for it. For remember, if no one knew evil, would justice be a question? No, but because there is evil, we are concerned with justice. And by the way, when I use the term in the biblical context of justice, it can and does refer to most of the ways we use it culturally, whether it be the criminal justice system, social justice as a community of people, and all the in-betweens. Just because someone uses the word wrongly doesn't mean you can't use it in the right ways. And so don't even worry yourselves about any of that. I want you to read with me right now in the text of Jeremiah in chapter 9. In the 9th chapter of Jeremiah, the Bible begins and includes in this. Jeremiah 9, verses 23 and 24, it begins, "Thus says or saith the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom, let not the mighty man boast in his might, let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices," catch it, "steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I delight, declares the Lord." Think for a moment now with your recognition and understanding of the idea that post-fall, post-fruit of the tree, that man knows both good and evil, but also shares in the image of God, with this statement: the Lord delights in steadfast love, justice, and righteousness, but not just as concepts. There are some things we like because it's pretty, right? I love the color of the sky. I love this artwork presented by a masterful artist, and I can look at it and see it. But the shift here goes in this way. It's the difference between admiring the prowess in another and seeing it practiced. Because again, it says, I am the Lord who practices, who does this steadfast love, who does justice and does righteousness. It's important for us to clarify and recognize that these are actions that we choose to engage in. We choose to live justly. We choose to live rightly. And we choose to love with stability, connection, and depth. So that word justice gets tossed around a lot, right? You see it in poetry, in prose. We see it in conversation. We see it in pain and anguish. I want justice. Or even more softened forms given in the same context. Mom, in my case, more personalized, what Dave did wasn't fair. Why is he being mean? Well, he's like 5 years older than you and you're annoying. Like, that's the real answer. But mom gets still like, okay, no, Dave, you got to be nice. You got to be fair to your little brother. And you've got to be kind to him. You know, being a little brother's tough. And my brother Dave would go, I don't care. He's little, I'm big. He's bothering me. I got stuff to do. What I have to, reach down to help him up to where I'm at just because he's 5 years younger. That's not fair, but it was just, right? Because fairness and justice hang out together, but they're not necessarily the same thing. That's a principle for us to consider because justice and righteousness, fairness and equity, these are all concepts that actually live in the same basket. They hang out together. They're part of the same tribe, if you will. And both of the words in the Bible, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament, that we then translate into English as justice and righteousness, overlap in very significant and special ways. They present to us a concept that should, in most hopeful ways, tell us about the nature of the King we follow, the disciples we want to become, and the God who is sovereign over all. In Romans in chapter 3, we've been in Jeremiah, now we're in the New Testament. Romans in the 3rd chapter. The Bible there reads in this way. This is chapter 3 and verse 21. But now the righteousness, remember, this is the God who delights in righteousness. Romans 3 verse 21. The righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Christ Jesus for all who believe. And he goes on and continues and says, for there's no distinction. And the text continues. It could be said to us that what Paul is describing to us in a certain degree is God's administration of justice. He's applying justice in a right way. Because as it relates to you and I, mankind, humans, righteousness should not be just about our individual relationship with our Creator, but it's actually now also about our neighbors, right? It's a relationship with all mankind in the big sense. Here's my example from the Scriptures. In Matthew in chapter 6, this is part of the grand Sermon on the Mount. We say this is the announcing of the kingdom. This is kingdom law, kingdom concepts, principles that we use. Think about this, chapter 6, verse 1. Beware of practicing your righteousness. Remember, that's the same as Jeremiah, as God does righteousness. Beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. For then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Often we pause in that text and we really talk about we got to make sure we're not showing out. We're showing off for others. Our intent is in consideration. But notice that Jesus doesn't leave us with that singular teaching, that intent, why you're doing it, is his goal. He goes on and says, thus, not if you give to the needy, but when. Do you notice the wording there? When you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly I say to you, others, they have received a reward. It's implicit, it's implied, it's expected that disciples of Christ would be the kind of people who intentionally support the oppressed, the uncared for, the needful. But they do so in a way that the reward is God-focused rather than man-focused. Because that's like an extension of the idea of a just and a righteous God. So just like God, Jeremiah, in Christ, Matthew, and in us, our righteousness and justice and kindness and care is implicitly engaged in. We're doing it. But this is not so much an admonition to be just, but a reminder of what justice looks like. So I want to suggest to you 4 biblical principles that occur through the Bible to help us understand how this justice weaves its way throughout all of our endeavors, both in practical application and conceptual ideas. Foremost, understand this. When we talk about justice, we're often talking about accountability, whether it's personal, corporate, national. And corporate is the community side of things, not just a corporation. Accountability is inherent. It's built into the concept of justice. For most people, maybe many, justice only has this aspect to it. It's the concept that is, when a person does something wrong, an authority, a judge, a king, an officer, God, assigns or implements some sort of penalty. And we expect that penalty to be consistent. Whether it's an eye for an eye, if we're going to try to trivialize the Old Testament, or even more specifically, justice is served when someone repairs to the damage to your car when it got hit in an accident. Now that's the just outcome, and I have received my recompense. And by the way, how many of you, when your car gets fixed, look at it and go, it's just like new? Is it just like new? Okay, it's not. Even if it looks like it's new. And if you're like me, you're going to constantly feel like it drives like there's something wrong. Like, I don't know what it is. But we say, but justice has been served, right? They paid, they fixed, it should be all right. Accountability has been satisfied. We should be satisfied as well. And to a certain degree we may be. But then we're like, but hey, that guilty individual who fixed it, maybe they need to get a little bit more crow down their throat to feel bad and have some of the consequences. God does have a concept of this responsive form of justice, and it's certainly in the Scriptures. You'll notice in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 16, the Bible writes there, fathers shall not be put to death because of their children, nor shall children be put to death because of their fathers. Each one shall be put to death for his own sin. This concept of consequence or accountability for action is woven through the biblical narrative, because biblical justice does require that an individual or a group is held accountable for their actions. And by the way, when we're the one who has done wrong, justice demands that we acknowledge our obligation, our culpability, and our responsibility, and all the consequences. Not only paying the bill, but accepting the weight of the response to it. But I want to point out the Bible doesn't leave justice in the hands of some unqualified entity on earth. We think of justice and we're thinking civil system, criminal system. That's where justice resides. In reality, justice extends actually significantly beyond that, because as I illustrated earlier, justice does include fairness. But not fairness in the way that is sometimes presented in the world ideologies of everywhere, but God's concept of fairness. You know, doing justice means not giving an unfair advantage to some to others. God uses terminology that are translated for us as he's no respecter of persons. That's one of the ways in which these concepts are brought to us. But even in the law and in the law of Christ, there were standards expected in order to make sure that there was a consistent, fair expectation. In the community of the biblical world, it was fairly normal to engage in trade through the use of measures and balances and scales. That was a normal way to figure things out. You and I do that too. I don't intend to harp on the price of gas, but I'm going to use this illustration because all of us probably feel the pinch of the pump just a little bit more. How many of us are confident to an absolute degree that when we put that pump in there, we're getting the amount of gas that we paid for? What do we trust, right? We trust that the system of weights and measures in the United States makes whatever that is the same for everybody else, right? Everyone's paying for 5 gallons of fuel at whatever nominative price it is, you get 5 gallons of fuel. Do you realize the Bible regulates that behavior in the Old Testament? In the text of Proverbs, you find this phrase laid out about a just weight. It occurs in particular in Proverbs 11 and verse 1. A false balance is an abomination to the Lord, but a just weight is his delight. In essence, no matter whom you were, if you went up to a shop in Israel and asked, in our case, for 5 gallons of gas, you should pay for and get 5 gallons of gas at the same rate as everybody else. Because that's fairness or justice in the biblical context. Further, God even noticed every time somebody withheld fair wages from a laborer. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 13. And yet, that kind of injustice happened in Israel. And I'll include that it happens today too, where people are not paid fairly for their work. And we do everything I can in our societies to try to kind of alleviate that, right? We form unions. We create laws that regulate employment behaviors, when you can work, how much you can work, when you have to take a break. If you've ever had a friend who works in the trucking industry, man, those guys have some regulations. How many of you didn't like it when your mama told you to go to sleep because you wanted to stay up and read a book? Is that just me? I'm the only one who wanted to read a book? Okay, you want to do other stuff. Maybe you want to play. But I wanted to read a book, right? If you guys in the trucking industry, for the long-haul truckers, they are regulated for the amount of sleep they have to engage in. Like they're told by the governing authorities that control that industry, you can't drive anymore, it's time to go to bed. You've had enough driving today. Mama says go to sleep. Because it creates a safe standard of fairness for all the other drivers around as well. You see, it's not just police officers, judges, lawyers, God, Christians. It's all and every person who interacts with other people, because justice demands we ask the question, is this fair? And fair sometimes also means picking up for someone who can't, because maybe they can't reach just yet. Biblical justice also means one more thing: responsibility. I'll suggest to you that this is a difficulty for us to understand sometimes on the collective level, though we might catch it on the individual level. Because personal accountability is a little bit different than responsibility. You do things not because you are accountable, but because you realize someone needs to be responsible in life. Because the more we think like individuals, the more we miss out of this communal nature of justice together. Because our individual choices, they do cause the benefit and harm of others. Think about it. This is why God has always held whole families, cities, nations, empires to the count, because as a group they engaged in injustice. In Isaiah 1, in chapter 1, verse 16, the Bible reads, "Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean, remove the evil deeds from before my eyes, cease to do evil, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, plead the widow's cause." That's God speaking through Isaiah to all of Israel. Even if some individuals were doing the right thing, they were all held to the standard as a group for not doing the right thing. Justice then demands, along with accountability and responsibility, in concert with the concept of true fairness, that we take responsibility for what happens around us. It means that we open up our mouth or move our bodies when we see someone being mistreated in any context. And understand that may mean that we have to attempt to repair what we didn't do. Even if it was a generation 2 or 3 behind us. I didn't make that mess. Why am I being asked to clean it up? How many times have you said that in your life? You come to clean a bathroom at work because you work there. I didn't make this mess. Who messed this up? Why is it my turn to clean it up that day? Because you just happen to be there. You're the first one there. You pick up the mess. Think deeply about what that means to relationships, to communities, and generations as a Christian who seeks God. Again, it means you have to attempt, and maybe even sometimes get successful in cleaning up and fixing and repairing the damage that somebody else has done that you never even met. One more concept. It's all tied together. Real justice in the biblical context means mercy. Justice doesn't make itself in the Bible as the enemy of mercy. It actually sees them as working hand in hand. Because biblical justice is often simply explained as being loving, merciful, gracious, generous, and restorative. Think back to Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. Jesus considered the act of helping the needy, charity, as doing justice or practicing righteousness. When we provide food, clothing, shelter to someone who needs it, we are actually doing justice or practicing righteousness. That means we're being merciful and generous to others on a practical level. And by the way, in Deuteronomy 24 and verse 19, this was an explicit command for Israel. So it wasn't something new. It was something applied that they should have been doing. And one of my favorite Old Testament books in the book of Ruth, which follows the awful but entrancing mess that is Judges, Boaz provides food to Ruth and Naomi. And he cares for someone who has great need, the fatherless and the widow. And in so doing, he actually does righteousness and does justice. And then he redeems them by being merciful to them, going one step further than he had to go. If you remember that story, he also had to go to family members and request the right to do so, because he had to go up the chain to make this request, because there was someone higher up in the relationship that, quite frankly, should have been doing it. But he still asked permission to do so. Those four principles, those four concepts actually find their wholeness in the gospel itself. So the bad reality is, no matter how much we have sought to do justice and sought to do righteousness and sought to do loving kindness in a steadfast way, we have all in some way been a participant in injustice. We have individually, most likely, been selfish, shirked, or forgotten our personal and sometimes group responsibilities. It is a guarantee that even without intent, you have treated someone unkindly. You have probably withheld goodness to somebody who needed it, especially when you had the power to make things better. If only our retribution level of God's justice existed in our mind, then we ought to be held accountable most deeply, significantly, and uniquely for what we have done.